Before we start, I gotta say, this is so nice for me because, like, ever since I started doing shit on this, I was hoping that someone would put together like a concise history of this, and I think this is it. I really do. I think it's important, you know?
I mean, what's the top line?
Yeah, the top line is that, Canada allowed the almost like the Western, if not like the global perception of World War II to be altered by importing these people and allowing them and supporting them in their attempt to rewrite history. And it was all done because Canada wanted to discipline labor domestically and do anti-communism, you know?
Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein.
Hello, hello, hello.
Hello, Liz.
I'm Liz,
My name is Brace. We are, of course, joined by producer.
Young Chomsky.
and this is TrueAnon. Hello, everyone.
Hello. We have a doozy.
A doozy and a twozy, because it's a two-part.
Mm-hmm.
But this is just the first part. And this has been an episode a long time in the making.
Yes, it has. I think one of my favorite things to read about and go crazy over is the post-war Nazi diaspora.
Mm-hmm.
And Canada, I feel like, has not gotten its due yet. I mean, people talk a lot about South America. People talk a lot about the USA. But Canada doesn't really get a lot of attention. And it's time to shine a light and hopefully soon a gun up north.
Well, to help us do that, we have a friend of the show, Dan Beckner, here, who is insanely well-versed in all of this, a researcher into the, I don't know, can we call it Canadian rat lines? Is that
guess
right?
So. A lot of it, we actually, that's the thing with this, is there's so much to get into, and there's so much that didn't even get into these episodes, because at the end of the day, you have to make a document that people can actually listen to and understand. And there's just a lot here. The rat lines, like the Vatican rat lines, were technically used, or really used, with the Waffen-SS Galicia division members in Italy. A lot of the Catholic clergy in the Vatican did help put their finger in a lot of this stuff. So yeah, the rat lines were used.
If you have no idea what we're talking about, you will soon, because we're going to get into it right now. Listen to the episode.
Hail and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We have a very special episode of TrueAnon today. We have brought in with us an exotic foreigner to discuss one of the strangest countries I've ever heard of, which is Canada. Welcome to the show, Dan Beckner, one of maybe 50 non-Hitlerian Canadians, former bass player for Rush, former Bongos, Our Lady Peace. He, of course, was the DJ in the style of Limp Bizkit, where you just do little scratches once in a while, for Len. He played the skin flute for Voivod. He was also briefly in Tegan and Sarah, when it was Tegan, Sarah, and Dan. He was in the band DOA, which stood for Dan's Ominous Asshole, and ominous because it was so scary to approach it, but many did. He also, I'm trying to think of other famous bands from Canada. He was also SNFU, not that famous, Dan, to be completely honest with you. They're not that famous. He was also in
Propaganda?
Oh, God, what a horrible group. No disrespect to any ska listeners out there, but that was a tough time for music.
But a really great name.
Propaganda. That was such a name of its time.
Yes.
That's
Remember
when they were,
Gandhi?
Indira? The
Welcome,
Lady Gandhi.
Dan. Hello.
Guten Tag, Brace and Liz. I mean, hello.
Dan, a question for you.
Yeah.
Canada, sort of above America, which, by the way, and I say this with zero irony or anything like that, if there was a successful, if America changed into a different kind of government of the type that maybe I would like. I'm no joke. We should annex Canada. It is absurd that is a different country.
Fantastic arable land you got up there.
I gotta say, Dan.
Yes.
Increasingly so with global
I was
warming.
going to say it's fundamentally not a different country, and
No.
we don't really have a distinct foreign policy. I think maybe we're a little more annoying about some things and less annoying about others, and that's really where the distinction stops.
It does appear that that you guys can just get killed by the Indian government basically at any point in time, which I do really appreciate. You're doing a little different up there. It is funny though. I was thinking about it. If we did successfully annex Canada, it would kind of be the shittiest part of America.
It would.
Why?
I mean, I think, I've always felt like Ontario specifically is like just an extension of Ohio.
Yes.
Ohio is where I live now. Ohio being good and Ontario being bad. So I think, Ohio would just extend up to the Quebec border, and it would be North Ohio, and it would be the shittier part.
I feel sort of romantic about Winnipeg.
You feel romantic about
what because of Guy Madden movies,
I think
or
because of
because
that
of
movie.
because of the band because of the band Propaganda?
Because of the Guy Madden movies I watched in my early 20s.
Yeah.
But to be fair, they were very good movies.
I don't think I understand women. I think Montreal would still be it is strange that people speak French on American soil.
We would have to go. I mean, we would have to go fight the Quebecois, which would be difficult.
Yeah.
I don't think it would be that difficult.
on.
I mean,
that hard.
Why not?
Because they lost to the British, and the British were like, instead of kicking you out, you can stay around. And they're like, great, now we want to separate,
But I feel like in this instance, we wouldn't fully be we wouldn't have the full force of the American military, because so much of the American military would have been defeated in this instance because we would have taken over the American government.
I got
You know what I'm
the
saying?
shit beaten out of me in Montreal when I was like 17 years old. And I probably told this story on the podcast before, but it was a long time ago. I was
Was
playing
it
a show.
for heckling Godspeed You Black Emperor?
No, I was playing a show and a guy had a beer and he was kind of like being jolly up front. And I was like, oh, give me a sip of the beer. And he put it sort of towards my face and I spit in it. And he just took me off stage and just started beating me down. And we ended up getting in a fight with all these guys. It was tough, but it was still the guy ended up being fine. Anyways, we're not here to talk about Voivod. We are here to talk about a crazy headline that I read in my most read newspaper of my life, which is the Ottawa Citizen.
Yeah.
And the headline read this: Victims of Communism Memorial faces call to remove over 330 names linked to Nazis, fascists.
I do like that they, separated those two. It's an important distinction. Distinction without a difference.
So it says the Department of Canadian Heritage is being told that more than half of the 550 names on the memorial to the victims of communism should be removed because of potential links to the Nazis or questions about affiliations with fascist groups, according to government records.
Mm-hmm.
This is a big oopsies.
It's a big whoops.
Yeah.
It's a big whoops that maybe some people have been ringing the alarm about for almost a decade now.
Yeah. I was reading a little bit more about this big memorial. There were supposed to be like 553 names on there. And like you said, there had already been some identified as, well, they say likely directly linked to the Nazis. There's the language that they use as like talking about this will be like somewhat linked, or they were collaborators. There's a lot of like kind of, I don't know, vague language, we'll say.
A lot of vague language.
But they had already flagged 50 to 60 names, which was like a big oopsies. And then we had this big story. But this, like you say, there were, organizations that had flagged a bunch of stuff. This is the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center, a Holocaust education organization, wrote St. Ange on October 10th to request the federal government make a firm and public commitment that the names of more than 300 individuals with suspected ties to the Nazis or fascist groups aren't put on the memorial. The organization has yet to receive a response. And so It seemed as if the government has kind of been like sidestepping this a little bit, not wanting to say very much about it, but that there are a lot of red flags around this Victims of
Yes.
Communism Memorial. Which,
So,
I will say this in their defense: the Nazis were victims of communism in the grand scheme.
They were. They got killed by communists. And I just want to say, like, just as an example of people who could be linked with the Nazi Party or quote unquote could be fascists. About 6 years ago, I started digging into the list of names because it was publicly made available on the Tribute to Liberty website. And I'm just going to, just so we can set the stage, I'm just going to read you one of the dedications that I found.
Absolutely.
In memory of the Dr. Ante Pavlich family. Dr. Ante Pavlich was Doctor of Law and the legal head of state for independent state of Croatia, and Croatia is spelled wrong, 1940 to 45. Tito's communists tried to assassinate him many times. He and his wife, Maria Lonkarovich Pavlich, sacrificed their lives and existence for family, God, and country and its people. And then it says, ZDZ, Bog I Hrvati, God and Croatia.
So
This is one of the possible fascist dedications.
So you're using air quotes around possible, just so our listeners are aware.
Just to let some listeners know, the independent state of Croatia was set up by the Nazis after Hitler and Mussolini invaded Yugoslavia and sort of created these little statelets with their little freaks in charge of them. Ante Pavlich was a Croatian ultra-nationalist who presided over a reign of terror in Croatia. Now, there's a lot of sort of it's I would say a cousin to sort of the clean Wehrmacht myth of the SS being horrified by what they saw in Estonia or what they saw in Croatia. But I gotta say, I think you sent me a picture yesterday of people in Ante Pavlich's organization sawing a head off of a Jew. And it's these guys were, it is incontrovertible. There's absolutely no, murkiness, no gray area in this. He was absolutely not a willing and very thankful collaborator with the Nazis who presided over the destruction of Croatia's Jewish community and homosexuals and gypsies, Serbs, and especially Serbs. It's insane that he was honored on that.
Yeah, and not just him, his entire family was represented, and his lawyer and several members of his cabinet, and Bishop Stefanovic, who was the head of the Catholic Church during the reign of Pavlich's Ustaše, and was instrumental in creating rat lines, which I know you guys have talked about before.
It's funny too, because I think about it. During World War II, obviously the British sent over, and the Americans, but the British, I think, were really kind of in charge of this, sent over advisors in Yugoslavia to help the partisans who fought against the Ustaše. Yeah. This is a guy who fought against, British and likely Canadian soldiers.
Absolutely.
And it's strange, too, because he's not exactly a victim of communism. They try to make it seem like he was shot, because he was shot. He was shot in, I think, Argentina in, I believe, the 1960s or 1950s. But he wasn't shot by a communist. He was shot by a Serb hotel owner who probably killed that guy's whole family.
Who fucking recognized him, I think.
Yeah, and he shot him.
That's a lot of these guys.
He didn't die right then from getting shot. He flees to fucking Franco's Madrid and then dies there several years later.
Yeah, he's buried in Spain and Madrid.
So this seems to be, I don't want to put all of this on you, but this does seem to be a running issue for Canada. There seems to be a lot of controversies about either memorials, statues, organizations, speakers being honored that were, how do I say it, Nazis.
Yes.
This seems to be a running thing. I have a quote here from a piece that was actually a report on the memorial back from last year, from 2023. And this is, the memorial, which is located near the corner of Wellington and Bay Streets, just for, locals if they want to go.
Classic
supposed to
downtown
honor-
Ottawa location.
is supposed to honor those who suffered under communism. But concerns have been raised over the years by Jewish organizations and historians that names of Eastern Europeans who collaborated with the Nazis in the Holocaust have been put forward in an attempt to whitewash their past. The memorial was supposed to be unveiled in November 2023, but that was put on hold after members of parliament honored Yaroslav Hunka, a Ukrainian soldier with the Waffen SS Galicia Division, a voluntary, I want to just, put a point on that.
Very important
An
part.
important point,
Yes.
a voluntary unit that was under the command of the Nazis. That incident became an international embarrassment for Canada. So I just want to talk really briefly before we get even more into this about that incident because it was really crazy.
It was extremely crazy.
Yeah.
It was one of the
you
greatest
know,
days of my life.
A lot of, I would like to say that I was surprised by that.
Yeah.
But when I started digging into what we're going to cover over these next two episodes, after about a month of just digging deeper and deeper into this Gordian knot of just Holocaust revision and using fascists to discipline labor and the just complete inaction of the Canadian government, I wasn't super surprised. And I think what we're going to find out during this episode is that there has been a concentrated project to basically rewrite the history of World War II, which has resulted in a SS volunteer who, in his own words, described 1941 to 1943 as the best years of his life, which, like anyone
a
who lived
Ukrainian
in
saying
Central
that.
Europe, like the literal fucking bloodlands, the
Yeah.
inspiration for come and see, the best years of his life. This guy is introduced, and you have the speaker saying, "We have here in the chamber today a Ukrainian-Canadian war veteran from the Second World War who fought for Ukrainian independence against the Russians and continues to support the troops today, even at his age of 98.
And it's funny because when Anthony Rota was saying that, you can see, I've watched the video many times, and he sort of pauses for a second as like, he tries to like remember, is like, wait, when was that?
Like he's getting a flash of the history books
Yeah.
of like, wait a second,
Yeah.
that means that he would be fighting on, he's like doing the kind of like
It's like,
triangle
wait,
lady
when was there
meme
a
math.
revolution for Ukrainian independence. That this guy
he's,
would have been
he's
in.
minority reporting different fascist groups and stuff that he learned in school. And,
He keeps pushing forward though and finishes it. And they receive. And, by the way, this was it was a visit by
Zelensky.
Zelensky and his wife. Yeah, it was a really big diplomatic visit.
And there was there was not one but two standing ovations.
The entire parliament. And then he was Trudeau invited him to like come to some kind of huge like get out the war effort kind of, rally that Trudeau was hosting, and everyone had to be like,
Correct.
"No, that's a Nazi. You can't do that." And it was everyone kind of, I think the way that it was portrayed in the press was like, "Oh, we just didn't do enough research there. Sorry, whoopsies."
Yeah, and well, there was a brief period where basically all of the kind of, I mean, I would call them useful idiots for this cause, like pseudo-liberal journalists came out swinging, basically being like, they deployed the party line, which is these men were forced to do this. Put yourself in their shoes. You can possibly understand how World War II is complex, And then I believe it was Ivan Kachanovsky, who's a professor at the University of Ottawa, translated Hunka's Ukrainian blog and was like, no, actually, this guy joined up. He's posted photos of himself in basic training, in Germany, which he kept and scanned.
Yeah, I mean, this is so like this is part of this process. So they're building this memorial, right? And we'll talk more about the memorial later because I think we have to set up a lot of who even goes into building this motherfucker. But they've been like planning on building this memorial for like 20 years, right?
Yes.
And it's supposed to be a memorial to all the victims of communism. Now, I looked into it. It doesn't seem to be the exact same thing as like the Victims of Communism Foundation in the U.S., although I'm sure they have many links. But I didn't even really look into that because I'm like, obviously they fucking do. But it uses essentially the same tactic of historical revisionism, not to like, talk about the poor victims of communism, but to really rehabilitate a lot of the losers of the Second World War. Now,
that's it. It is it will be a living monument to the losers and the haters.
Yes. And so
who are Nazis, by the way?
Who were Nazis.
Just to
It's funny because that's kind of a
clear.
continuation of the project. A lot of the times you'll hear people be like, "Oh, communism killed 100 million people," and you'd be like, "Wow, 100 million people?" And then you realize that they get that figure, or that figure comes from this thing called the Black Book of Communism, which is a collection of anti-communist essays written by some fucking hater and loser from France, who, by the way, many of the people who wrote essays in that book later retracted and said, like, this is not good because this guy is a freak who put this together. But that figure actually includes basically everybody who died in the Eastern Front of World War II, including every single member of the SS, Wehrmacht, Waffen-SS, etc., as a victim of communism. And to that I say, yes, they were.
Yeah. Ciao, bye.
So is this memorial being planned in like a big public space in Canada?
It is. It's had a long history of public disapproval. Like when it first, and we'll get into this later, but when they first floated this idea, the public response was like, "What? Why are we doing this?" At one point, and again, I guess we'll get into it later, but at one point they were going to set the site of it across the river from the Holocaust Memorial.
Jesus Christ.
Interesting. A good like sniping position.
Yeah.
To like if there's anyone, we didn't get him.
But the short version is the entire project on a material level has been plagued with like mismanagement and just absolute institutional bloat. So like the Victims of Communism Memorial in DC has cost a fraction of what this still unbuilt monument has cost American or Canadian taxpayers.
Oh, because the taxpayers are paying for it?
They're paying for part of it. So it is it's odd. It's a public-private project. It started as a private project within the Conservative Party, and then after they lost, it was moved over to the Liberal government and became the purview of the Ministry of the Heritage Ministry. But you also have the Tribute to Liberty people, this coalition of losers and haters, various diaspora groups. You have the Tribute to Liberty people soliciting donations from the public to help build this thing as well. But the cost now is upwards of $7.3 million, I think.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Well, I think to set the stage for this a little bit, we have to talk about, and I hate to say it, we have to go kind of back to the 1800s. We're going to go forward in a second. We got to go back to the 1800s and talk about immigration to Canada.
Everyone's favorite sexy topic.
So, Dan, I'm under the impression that, you look at Canada on a map, right? And once you wipe the spit off the map that you just involuntarily hawk to it up on there,
Spit on that thing, you get me?
you realize that most of Canada is basically an uninhabited wasteland, right?
It's extremely empty, especially anything north of the border. It's like the population is really clustered close to the United States border, and then gets more sparse as you go up.
But there's a lot of sort of, let's say, it's like a whole country made up of the Midwest. There's a lot of open space there. Not a lot of Lebensraum. Not a lot of people to fill it. And even less so back in the 1800s. So Canada has, it seems like, up until like really the post-war era, kind of a problem with not having enough immigrants. Everyone was like, we want to go to the USA. There's Italians there. They're going to invent pizza pretty soon. They're inventing French fries. Girls are super fucking hot. There's cities.
It's not freezing.
We're not weirdly kind of part of England, but we live in Canada. Like, it's weird because like it seems like the country below us kind of got out of England and did really well. We kind of are still in England, not doing so well, but whatever. And so, like, you guys couldn't get that many people. And it seems like the biggest groups of people that you could get were German immigrants and then Ukrainian immigrants.
Yes. And there's a great quote from the Prime Minister at the time, which kind of explains the Canadian lust for Ukrainian immigrants, which was He said, "We need stalwart peasants in sheepskin coats to work the land."
I guess that makes sense because Canada is like kind of cold, and like I feel like if I was a farmer in Canada, I would have like a potato that I would like water in like, you know, with an astrakhan or whatever these things are called on, and just like going cold.
And I think a lot of the Ukrainians that came over to put on sheepskin coats and work the land were disappointed when they settled in places like Manitoba and rural Alberta, and were like, "Okay, it's minus 40 degrees Celsius."
Yes, yeah.
my
It's like,
You gotta work it real
my
extra
shovel
hard.
broke
it's
off
like
in the
somehow
fucking permafrost.
colder
Yeah.
than
Yes.
Eastern Europe over
Bleaker
here.
than the Ukrainian steppe in December. You know?
But there, you know, the Canada has a huge prairie, and actually like tried to really entice farmers to come over and be like, work this land, become farmers here. You know, come over and we'll remake beautiful Galicia here on the Canadian prairie.
Without the czar, so you don't have to worry about the czar breathing down your neck.
Well, that
It's
was
a-
the thing, right? Like Ukrainians back in the 1800s, in the early 20th century, were kind of like stuck in these different empires, right? You know,
Poland
yeah,
and-
well, not really an empire, no disrespect.
Yeah, well,
It was a Commonwealth.
It was about common, not a lot of wealth there.
Hey.
But
Whoa.
yeah, they were like stuck in Poland, and they were stuck in the Russian Empire, and they were stuck in the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Yeah.
And none of them really liked it. And so they were like, let's get the fuck out of here and go
let's
somewhere.
go to Canada.
Let's go to fucking Canada. From what I understand, though, is a lot of the Ukrainian immigrants at this time were sort of left-wing. You know, there was like a lot of socialist organizations that sprouted up in these Ukrainian communities that moved to Canada. It's interesting because, you know, like a lot of kind of ethnic communities or ethnic immigration to the Americas, they would sort of like gather around in their own communities and like start organizations, and like you would still speak, you know, you would speak Ukrainian there. You know, you would essentially like transpose village life from, you know, whatever, Western Galicia to you know, the Canadian prairie. And as a result of that, they would start these like kind of organizations where they teach people how to read English. You know, they would have like, you know, study groups maybe about politics. They would have, you know, theater groups. And this is a pretty common trait among a lot of like ethnic immigrants who come over and sort of started these kind of proto-socialist or socialist organizations.
The Ukrainians were incredibly organized around that. And, you know, you mentioned theater, and there was a nationwide circuit eventually of these cultural halls and labor halls where people would go and play music and put on plays, write plays. And a lot of the backdrop was leftism and like, you know, this sort of rising, like these people had communication with relatives back home. They read the news, you know, they saw the Bolshevik Revolution happen. They applied their own, you know, kind of labor struggles to that ideology. And yeah, it was a rich community. There was also sort of on the other side, the right-wing side of it would have been more the church.
Yes.
Like the bourgeois and the church. The church kind of represented, as far as I understand, the interest of the bourgeois and the upper class.
Yeah, you know, it's I think kind of the common belief, which I think is true, is that like many Ukrainians, probably most Ukrainians that immigrated to Canada pre-World War I and really like pre-1930 were left-wing. And the reality is that there were right-wing Ukrainians who started these sort of strange organizations, the Ukrainian Catholic Brotherhood, the Ukrainian Self-Reliance League, the Hetman Party, who we'll talk about a little later. The Hetmanites, the Ukrainian Workers' League, and then on the left, there was the Ukrainian Labor Farmer Temple Association, which is really what you're talking about there.
Yeah, the UFLTA, you know, in a lot of ways can be seen as kind of responsible for laying the groundwork for, you know, a proto version of healthcare. Even you could go into these temple halls and get treated. It's pretty amazing that they set that up, and you know, it's that we're talking about this right now, but just to keep coming back to the main point, like it is sad that history has basically been written out in Canada.
Yeah. I was going to say it's so reminiscent of like, I mean, it basically mirrors almost exactly what was happening in Western Europe, like in terms of the sort of social dynamics, but then also the like emerging social like conflicts between these kind of nationalist organizations
Yes.
and these proto-socialists, or even, as you're saying, like maybe straight up socialist, like labor organizations and different leagues that were forming among, workers and farmers and peasants out in Canada.
Well, this is the thing about ethnic immigration. I say ethnic, but you know what I mean. I'm talking about like some fucking Poles and Hungarians and Romanians and stuff.
Yeah.
Really European immigration to America was seen as, especially in this period, and we're talking about here like early 20th century, pre-World War I, during World War I, these were actually seen as like enemy aliens coming in who were going to spread communistic Bolshevik ideals among working people. And so like, for instance, during the first Red Scare in America, a lot of the people they just rounded people up that were immigrants and deported them. That was like the big thing with that, with the Palmer raids and everything. In Canada, there wasn't
too.
In Ukraine too, but in Canada there was actually internment for a lot of Ukrainians during the First World War. Obviously, in both America and in Canada, there was IWW, but there was these sort of social democratic organizations, really proto-communists that just called themselves social democratic because no one called themselves really communist yet, that were anti-war because they saw it as an imperialist war and agitated against the war, and that was actually illegal. And so these groups would get broken up, these people would get jailed, and there was internment in Canada for the duration of the war for a lot of people, for a lot of left-wing Ukrainians. After the war, things were a little different. The sides were splitting a little more because the Bolshevik Revolution had happened. The old empires in Europe had been destroyed, and things were changing. And a lot of the people kind of coming over, the losers of the Russian Civil War in Ukraine, were coming over and were like, guys, something really bad has happened over there. We gotta change things.
I don't know if you guys know this, but they're taking our stuff.
They're taking our shit over there. We just lost a crazy war.
Yeah.
We gotta kind of get our shit together over here. I want to talk a little bit about the Hetmanites, the Hetman Party for a second.
Yeah.
Nationalists were somewhat marginalized on the Canadian-Ukrainian left. But the Hetmanites had this weird kind of undue influence in these rather seedy parts of Canadian society. Now, this is the interwar years we're talking about here. So they were also, the same sort of people were organized in the Ukrainian National Federation, which was affiliated with the OUN, which we'll talk about a lot in these episodes, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which later became a sort of puppet guerrillas of Nazi Germany and then sort of their own Nazi center after the war,
and
Nazi CIA
later
center.
puppet guerrillas of the CIA.
Yes, exactly. The homegrown fascism in the Americas in the interwar period is very funny, basically. I mean, you had the German-American Bund. You also had a Bund in Canada. You had the Silver Shirts. But in Canada, you guys also had something called classocracy.
Which is a crazy-ass name, by the way.
I know. And it's like, come on. That's what you named it? You thought that was going to win?
It is what it says it is,
Well, classocracy were started by a guy named Walter Bossy, whose real name, and not to be one of these guys or whatever, but his real name is Vladimir Bossier. And it's got the AE combination in there.
This guy's like a Ruthenian, right? Like he's from Transcarpathia, like a hotbed of like psychotic nationalist insurgency. I think when you're isolated, like I've been through that area several times, like once on tour in Ukraine and a few times when I was in Romania, ending a tour and just cruising around. And I could see, I don't know if either of you have ever been to a geographical location where that like bad ideas foment there.
Yeah, yeah.
Like the Bay Area, I feel like is maybe one of those places.
Yes.
Idaho and the Ruthenian Transcarpathia.
That's you would say that's a nexus of darkness, perhaps.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, this guy, I mean, he splits after World War I, obviously, and he comes over to Canada, and he's kind of in thrall of these like the Hetman sort of ideology that's being formed in Europe at the time. And the Hetmans are sort of like I would say Ukrainian royalty, to put it very, 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 very simply.
Like Cossack royalty.
Cossack
basically.
royalty. Yeah, I guess that's a better way to put it. But there was sort of a Hetmanite ideology being formed in Europe a little before this, but also during this period. So in Canada, this kind of becomes transformed a little bit into essentially what is a bourgeois, unrefined form of fascism. Now, obviously, fascism is itself bourgeois, but this is just like, it's like sub fascism. It's really kind of dumb guy fascism that still like tries to mimic a lot of the reactionary tendencies of the Ukrainian royalists, in which he kind of surrounded himself with. Bossy, I'm talking here, but became something kind of different when it met Canada. Bossy was given work by the Catholic Church, and the party was supported by them. He also, spent a lot of time in Quebec, where a lot of the Catholic fascists kind of like were organized. He also spied for the RCMP and began to tour the country, informing on left-wing Ukrainians, and his ideas were embraced and his friendship solidified with the French-Canadian Führer and friend of Ernst Zundel, Adrian Arcand. And so
Le Führer.
I know, Le Führer. Adrian Arcand, who was this like, I'm sorry, a fucking idiot who was like trying to do Nazism in Canada.
Just a complete fucking loser.
Yes.
Later friends with Ernst Zundel. So.
Yes. But this guy, Arcand, gets a lot of his inspiration and ideas from Walter Bossy. And so, like, you can see this, like, fascist nexus kind of forming here with a lot of these losers of World War I, a little, foreshadowing for the future there, and these, like, homegrown, very Catholic, very fascist entities. That friendship with Arcand is not mentioned anywhere in Walter Bossy's biography in the Encyclopedia of Ukraine, which...
Really quick, can we explain what the Encyclopedia of Ukraine is?
Yep. I can do that. There was a Ukrainian nationalist leader named Volodymyr Kubiovich, and he was essentially prime minister of like nationalist Ukraine. Very good friends with high-ranking Nazis. Very committed to the cause of eradicating Jewry from Ukraine. He somehow managed to slip his way out of the country after the Red Army came in. He was in Germany for a while, and then he landed in Paris. And his life's work was to write basically an encyclopedia of Ukraine that was a nationalist vision of Ukraine. So it was an encyclopedia of the nationalist projected fantasy of Ukraine. And as we'll find out later, like he did so with the help of the Canadian government and the University of Alberta.
It's funny. I looked up basically everybody we talk about in this episode in the Encyclopedia of Ukraine. Yeah. And just to see, because we talk about a lot of people who fought in the Waffen SS, a lot of people who did the Holocaust. And interestingly enough, very little of that is mentioned in the Encyclopedia of Ukraine. So I would call the Encyclopedia of Ukraine very much a Holocaust revisionist document. Right? Not a Holocaust denial one, but a Holocaust revisionist document.
Well, there is an entry for anti-Semitism where Kubiovich says Ukrainian nationalists were not anti-Semitic.
I find that very interesting.
Which doesn't really square with the fact that the Holocaust, what's called the Holocaust of bullets, happened.
Well, it also doesn't square with the fact that the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists in like 1941 made a pronouncement during their like sort of public pledge of allegiance to the Nazi government that they were going to rid Ukraine of Judeo-Bolshevism. I mean, this is in like all of their pronouncements and things like this, dropped after the Second World War publicly. But in reality, in Ukraine at this time, okay, so you have like Walter Bossy and these like kind of like Hetmanites, right, who are organizing with these fascists and also spying for the government. The government understands that these guys are Nazis, that they are crazy, rabid anti-Semites, that they are, they're starting this classocracy to overthrow the Canadian government, fascist dictatorship, whatever. But really, they're like, please, actually, can you spy on the communists for us? Because at this point, a third of the Communist Party of Canada is Ukrainian.
That's right.
It is huge. A ton of them fought in Spain, and the Canadian government does not really like this. So the Ukrainian Farmer Labor Temple Association, which at this point has been affiliated with the Communist Party of Canada, is like being tracked by the RCMP. They are like completely spying on them in essentially all aspects of what they do.
Yes. I mean, later on, the RCMP will help recently imported fascists seize property
Yes.
from various groups. I remember talking to someone's grandfather in Edmonton who described this era as, they would go, these groups would go and have like, he played guitar at one of these temples. That was his job, and he remembered RCMP backing up Ukrainian fascists who kicked the door down and just beat the shit out of everybody while the cops stood around and watched.
Yeah.
That was the vibe.
Yeah, yeah. And in fact, the Communist Party of Canada was banned in, I think, 1935. The UFLTA was banned on June 4th, 1940, where, just like you mentioned, the government shut down like 180 halls they had all around the country. They seized them. They took all of their money, all of their records, everything, and then they gave a bunch of the halls to these smallish right-wing nationalist organizations.
Yeah.
They also gave printing presses to them. They gave newspapers to them.
Yeah, which is important because it's sort of setting the groundwork for what will come later, which is a sort of rewriting of not just the history of World War II, but actually the history of the Ukrainian people as it pertains to like learning about it in Canada,
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's crazy because, I mean, I think that act of seizing the halls and then giving to these right-wing organizations is such like a blatant, like it's trying to put your foot down and change history there, because you have all of these left-wing immigrants. You have this really like, this thriving community. You have these, these halls where there's music and there's dancing and there's this social thing, what's often called hall socialism. And you just shut that down and you're like, actually, we're going to give it to these guys who are like, we should kill every fucking Jew. That's the end of the preview. If you'd like to hear the rest of the episode, which has so much good stuff in it, go to www.patreon. There might have been too many W's. Patreon.com/TrueAnonPod.
Patreon.com/TrueAnonPod. Bye-bye.